So, with The Lost World's big success at the box office, you'd think it'd be a no-brainer to try and cash off the success of the movie while it's still relevant. It became one of the most well-known films of that year, as well as being a major box office success, all thanks in part to the special effects that made the dinosaurs feel real. Willis O'Brien, the man mostly responsible for this feat, had learned so much from working on The Lost World that he knew he can create pretty much anything for cinema. Unfortunately, many hardships led to O'Brien's visions never being realized in the coming years, ultimately feeling like his talent has wasted potential throughout the years to come. However, luck would soon shine upon the animator when a fateful encounter with a man who both knew and experienced adventure would come into his life with a story treatment that would become one of the most beloved films for many generations to come. But the road to this fantasy film is one with many hardships and struggles. This is the story of the creation of a king. In 1925, the motion picture titled The Lost World was an outstanding cinematic breakthrough in the film industry. It garnered much praise from the public and even became a financial success, grossing over $1 million on a $700K budget. The company that distributed the film, First National Pictures, knew the movie would open doors for many more like it, and on February of 1925, First National Pictures GM Richard A. Rowland declared that a sequel film to The Lost World would begin production in the studio's New York facilities. He even announced the film was in progress while The Lost World was still being worked on. This new original story was titled Atlantis, based on the fictional utopia of the same name. Earl Hudson, the production supervisor of The Lost World, was set as both the writer and producer of the picture. Willis O'Brien and Ralph Ramirez would also come on board to aid in the production, with the two spending months to gather as much information as possible about the mythical island, as well as come up with conceptual art to envision on what the fantasy picture would look like. The plot revolved around the discovery of another lost world, inhabited by superhumans who subjugated everything in their nation. The gods then rid the world of their threats by conjuring up an earthquake and pushing them to the bottom of the sea. The story called for creatures like sea serpents that dwelled in the depths of the ocean, as well as enormous mastodons that the Atlanteans would hunt down for food. On November of 1926, Atlantis was billed as one of First National's upcoming motion pictures. But due to production setbacks and financial constraints, the movie never released and was quietly cancelled. First National soon shut down their studio in New York and moved back to Burbank, California. Ramirez was also transferred with the company, and sculptor Marcel Delgado even went to maintain his job as a handyman for the corporation, leaving Willis O'Brien back to square one, without any work. After Atlantis was scrapped, Obie fell on hard times, with a crumbling relationship, enduring in heavy alcoholism, and getting nowhere with a number of failed projects, such as adapting the H.G. Wells novel The Food of the Gods, which centered around special food that turns living organisms into giants. Another idea Obie had was to adapt the novel of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which First National Pictures had shown interest in, and even greenlit the project. Obie was back in business and ready to bring his effects to life once more, until shortly out of nowhere, the film was cancelled. O'Brien knew he had talent to create amazing things for cinema, but he also knew that executives were never going to go with his ideas due to them being too costly with the effects work, as well as being too time-consuming to animate. Soon after Frankenstein was canned, First National was brought out by Warner Brothers in 1928, with Obie stepping down from the company soon after. In summer of the following year, the Lost World director, Harryhausen, approached the film distribution company, known as RKO, with a story treatment similar to the Conan Doyle tale he had worked on before. This project was titled Creation. It was the story about a group of aristocrats shipwrecked on an island in South America, filled with prehistoric animals. The crew would have to fight and escape for their lives, as well as find a way back to civilization. Hoyt explained to the executives how the dinosaurs would have come to life, telling them about Willis O'Brien and his incredible talent to make these extinct animals appear live on screen, thanks to the technique known as stop-motion animation. William LeBaron, RKO's vice president of production, was fascinated by the idea, and gave Creation the green light to begin production, giving the film a $1.2 million budget. Willis O'Brien was about to put his talent to use once again. To help with the dinosaur models, Obie got in contact with an old friend of his, Marcel Delgado. to ask for his assistance in creating the dinosaur models, just as he did for The Lost World. Delgado was more than happy to leave his job and join the project, and soon after arriving, began creating the creatures in a similar style to the Charles R. Knight paintings. To help visualize how specific sequences will unfold, O'Brien got the talent of Mario Larranaga, Byron Crabb, and Ernest Smythe, who submitted several illustrations depicting important moments within the film, including that of an Arsenitherium chasing down a group of people, a Pteranodon carrying away a young woman, and a Stegosaur battling a Tyrannosaur in a crumbling temple, just to name a few. The plot, storyboards, models, and even a few live animals were ready to go to make the movie a reality. O'Brien was anxious to get animating. However, handling the stop motion wasn't going to be done the way he had worked on it in the past. Because creation, and all films like it now, had sound, his stop motion techniques had to be slightly altered, due to the technicalities of an optical soundtrack, the transcription of audio into lines that are written on the film itself, and then translated back to the sound by the projector, requiring that the film be shown at a pace of 24 frames per second rather than a silent film's speed of 16 frames per second. Obi had to train himself to create 30% more movement for every second of footage. His creature's motions had to be done with smaller incremental movements. It added more work, but Obi was determined to make this the best project he had ever been a part of. Little did he know that things were about to take an unfortunate turn for the picture. While creation and other films like it were being worked on at RKO inside a studio, outside, things weren't looking too positive. By 1929, America had fallen under hard times with the Wall Street crash, which had disastrous financial repercussions for the country. The stock market had lost about half of its value, from over $60 billion to about $30 billion. This was the time of the Great Depression, one of the most cloudiest events in US history. Citizens were in a panic, the workforce was slowly declining, and businesses were starting to close their doors permanently. The Depression took a massive hit on RKO. The company was already barely keeping its lights on, and the last batch of films under its name didn't do so hot at the box office, and failed to make any sort of impact that could save the corporation. Creation's budget was also stinging the company badly. The film had already used $100,000 of its budget just to do test shots. Sadly, the film was slowly going nowhere. To make matters worse, William LeBaron, RKO's vice president of production, resigned after failing to streamline the company's expenses. With no time to spare, RKO president B.B. Kane hired a former Paramount employee named David O. Selznick as the new vice president in charge of production. Selznick had a very difficult and demanding task: to try and save RKO from going bankrupt. This meant cutting salaries and putting a halt to all the films that were currently being worked on, to try and see if any of them were worth investing into, or to cease the production of ones that didn't seem like box office booms. Due to the task being so daunting, Selznick hired a friend of his he had met while working for Paramount. That man is Merian C. Cooper. Cooper was an adventurous man who had made several pictures beforehand, and had agreed to the job only on the condition that Selznick would allow him to create his own motion pictures for the studio, particularly with a story he had been dreaming up since 1929. A story of adventure, thrills, and a story that would star one of the most famous movie monsters of all time. On October 24th, 1893, Merian Caldwell Cooper was born in Jacksonville, Florida. At a young age, Cooper took an interest in literature, and by the age of 6, his uncle had given him a book titled Explorations and Adventures in Equatorial Africa. The book would center around tales in the African jungles, including events featuring large gorillas. The story would leave such an impression on Cooper's young mind that it became one of his inspirations into wanting to become an explorer. The first true thrilling adventure Cooper would undertake was his participation in the First World War, joined in the infantry before being transferred to the Aviation Corps as a DH-4 bomber pilot. During one of his flights, Cooper was shot down and captured by the Germans, serving out the remainder of the war in a POW camp, with many believing him to be dead. After the war ended, Cooper was repatriated and traveled to Vienna, volunteering for the American Relief Organization. It was there that he would meet a lifelong friend of his, Ernest B. Schoedsack. Schoedsack had entered the war as a combat cameraman, risking his neck to film footage for the U.S. Signal Corps and Red Cross. Schoedsack had shown the same thrill for adventure, only he showed it with his photography skills. Cooper and Schoedsack would encounter each other several more times, with the two often considering about making their own motion pictures. But financially, they wouldn't know how to make that work, until Cooper had encountered a man who would give them that privilege. In September of 1922, Captain Edward A. Salisbury, the owner of a two-master schooner designed for ethnological excursions, employed Cooper as a first officer, and secretly a ghostwriter, due to Salisbury wanting to make entertainment for the film industry. Cooper contacted Schoedsack to volunteer to be the camera operator for the trip after the initial cameraman had quit. The duo not only captured footage for Salisbury, but also managed to get their own shots for a personal film. Unfortunately for the duo, the film would perish in a fire caused by a gas explosion that exploded the ship the footage was being stored on, losing their very first film. Instead of moping their loss, the two immediately thought of another film project to work on, and began thinking of a story about the struggles of man against nature, aiming to film in the mountains of Persia. Cooper had traveled to New York City in order to secure funding for the project. There, he ran into Margaret Harrison, a friend Cooper had made during his involvement in the Polish-Soviet War. Harrison had shown interest in Cooper's film, and was willing to donate $5,000 on the condition that she can travel with them to Persia. While Cooper gave the okay to the proposal, his partner Schoedsack was very against it, believing a woman shouldn't belong on a dangerous trip. Regardless of the matter, the three set out to make the first Cooper-Schoedsack production, titled Grass, A Nation's Battle for Life, a film about the tribe of the Bakhtiari people traveling through harsh conditions to reach the grasslands to help feed their livestock. A majority of the film was shot on location, with the trio toughing out the rough conditions shown in the picture. The movie was the first in the Cooper-Schoedsack lineup, where the two had the motto to make their films distant, difficult, and dangerous. The movie Grass was a modest success, and prompted the duo to make other adventure-style films, such as their next film, titled Chang, A Drama of the Wilderness, a movie centering around a family in Thailand trying to survive day-to-day life with ferocious animals lurking about. Later, the duo would work on another drama picture titled The Four Feathers, based on the AEW novel of the same name. While shooting for the film in Africa, Cooper had spotted a group of baboons. He was fascinated by their behavior and began observing them whenever he could. They reminded him of the gorillas in the book he had once read as a child, and soon found out that these gorillas did indeed exist. Once he had some free time, Cooper took a trip to West Africa to observe the gorillas. They weren't as big as he had pictured them being, but they were still fascinating creatures nonetheless. After filming had wrapped up for The Four Feathers, Cooper flew back to New York and began working on a monograph. While doing so, he kept thinking about the apes, and wanted to create a motion picture centering around them. To help spark an outline, Cooper had recently read a book by a friend of his, William Douglas Burton. The book was titled Dragon Lizards of Komodo. The tale told of an expedition discovering large reptiles found on Komodo Island in the Dutch East Indies. At the time, Komodo dragons were vastly unknown creatures to the modern world. The Burton story concludes with the reptiles being captured and brought back to New York, where they would perish in their new environment. Intrigued by the tale of the carnivorous lizards, Cooper began imagining a movie in which the large reptiles would fight gorillas. There was a popular belief that said that Cooper had thought to capture real gorillas and bring them to the island of Komodo to have them fight actual Komodo dragons. Though over time, sources have rectified this as the saying Cooper actually wanted to intercut footage of the two animals fighting by using props or men in suits to show the two interacting. As time went on, Cooper's gorilla story began flourishing bit by bit. Instead of a plot about multiple gorillas, the narrative only focused on a single one. This one ape would also be characterized as being both monstrous as well as intelligent. The ape would also be larger than a normal gorilla, being a threat to not only humans, but to other ferocious reptiles it shared its surroundings with. Cooper's new draft presented a story of an expedition that ventures to a desolate island where they find a gigantic gorilla that battles prehistoric lizards and kidnaps their female crew member. The crew fight to reclaim her and eventually captures and transports the gorilla to New York to be displayed for fame. For the film's ultimate climax, Cooper had thought of the giant ape escaping its captivities and running amok across the city streets of New York, eventually climbing the tallest building in Manhattan, which at the time was the Chrysler Building, and having the beast shot down by aircrafts. In many ways, the story mirrored elements in that of Burton's Komodo dragon tale, even down to the last bit about the animals meeting their end in New York. Cooper's idea had been set. Now came the difficult part, trying to get a studio to actually make it. Cooper had tried places like Paramount and MGM, but either companies didn't have much interest in the story, or they knew the film would be too costly to produce. It didn't help that the Great Depression was already in effect. Studios at the time couldn't take the risk on financing effects-heavy projects. With no luck in sight, Cooper had shelved the gorilla story to focus on other things, until one day he was contacted by David O. Selznick, who was recently hired at RKO as vice president in charge of production. Selznick had worked with Cooper before on The Four Feathers, and wanted him to work for him as his executive assistant, coming in to decide whether ongoing projects the studio was working on should be continued or shelved in order to prevent RKO from going bankrupt. One of the projects that had to be heavily looked over was the one titled Creation. At that moment, it was RKO's largest invested movie, and it already costed the company over $100,000. The film had been in production for nearly a year, and barely anything was fully completed for it. Creation also faced many unfortunate setbacks, with live-action photography dates being constantly pushed back, effect sequences being cut, and most importantly, the film's budget increasing daily. Cooper had gone over the script and saw the test footage. After taking everything into account, that included the budget, he ultimately thought the movie wasn't worth saving, feeling the story was nothing but a bunch of animals walking around, lacking any sort of narrative. Selznick agreed, and Creation was cancelled. Director of the picture, Harry Hoyt, was even laid off. He tried to obtain the rights to his story, but was refused. Even though the film was canned, Cooper, while not fascinated with the story of Creation, was at least intrigued by the process in which it was being made. The fact that an entire jungle set can be filmed without leaving the studio, as well as witnessing the wonderful magic of stop-motion animation, which gave extinct animals their lives back. Cooper's eyes were genuinely awakened by the brilliance of film effects. It was because of these components that Cooper knew his gorilla picture could finally be made. Willis O'Brien and his team, who had brought these amazing creatures to life, while heartbroken of Creation's cancellation, would soon get another chance to put their talents to use. And it would be thanks to their efforts, combined with Cooper's adventurous gorilla tale, that one of the greatest monster movies of all time was about to be created.